Hello there and welcome to Discover History, the podcast where people from all walks of life discuss the topics they are passionate about. In today's episode, we will be discussing the history of one of the world's best known bands, the Beatles. We are joined by Steve Anderson to take us through this magical mystery tour. Hello Steve and welcome to the show.
Hi.
Well, why don't we just start at the beginning, and what can you tell us about the formation of the band?
Okay, so the Beatles are formed the late 50s. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, teenagers, they get a chance to pawn each other, performing at a local fete like a gala day, and they both realised that both of them wrote songs. It was the first time they ever found someone that wrote songs other than themselves, and then they had the same interest, the musical interest, that blossomed from there. Now, two wasn't enough for a band, so they found out that the school bus driver, his son, he's called George Harrison. He played guitar, so he auditioned for them on a public bus, the back of a public bus. He played a guitar solo. It's quite tricky, and he got in the band. He was about 2 years younger than Paul, 3 years younger than John. At that age, is quite a big difference as teenagers. And then they had a local drummer called Pete Best, and John's pal from art college called Stuart Sutcliffe, who became the bass player. Though he wasn't a musician as such, he was just John's pal.
And is it true why they kind of got George in, that Paul McCartney was originally going to be the solo guitarist, but he went to play a gig, really messed it up, and was like, that's no for me?
Yeah, he got all twitchy, and he said he never played lead guitar again for years after that. He's been good for years since then, but he needed someone else to step in at that time.
I've seen as well that they spent a lot of time, obviously, just poor kids from Liverpool, on the bus going to places, and that's where they cemented their songwriting team for John and Paul.
Yeah, I mean, Paul tells a story now. Obviously, if you want to know how to play an instrument, you just go on YouTube and it's everything's there. Well, they didn't know what chords were. They had a guitar, didn't know how to tune it, and somehow were able to tune it and work out. And they didn't know. They knew. I think they knew two chords, E and A. These are like the most basic kind of guitar chords that you can get. And someone told them that someone across Liverpool knows how to play B7. It's like, B7, that could unlock the key to more songs. That gives a third chord. So they all got on the bus and they all went across Liverpool and this guy drummed dum 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 dum, and he went back and he learned it and he went zing, showed all his friends. That's how Paul described it, just like that. Those sound effects as well. Yeah, so they got three chords. They wrote some songs with three chords, and all their songs were just major keys until after their first album years later, when they only started, they put a minor chord in the first song. It was all kind of simple at first, very simple, three chords and stuff for a while.
I remember hearing Paul talk about that. I think it was on Anthologies, and it was the same with the lyrics as well, that they took very simple subjects and then they advanced it like step by step almost. Yeah,
just like the music. I guess there was no real complexity in the air in the music that they listened to. It was all about the sound and the excitement of the sound and rock and roll, which was a new thing then. As they were hearing it for the first time, everyone was hearing it for the first time because it had just been really created, that genre, in the 50s. Yeah, so as John said that lyrics were not important back then, to him anyway, and it was just all about the sound. And so the lyrics were just kind of fillers, they were just kind of very simple kind of fillers, and as long as they rhymed, sort of thing. So, there's nothing to it. I love you, she loves me, and stuff like that.
I think that comes across in the early music. It is that excitement for that early rock and roll that they got over from America.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll make so we've got a playlist going with this. I'll make a reference to the first song on the playlist. It's a classic song called "I Saw Her Standing There." It's the first song in the first Beatles album, but that just kind of sums up the excitement of the era, the sound, and the kind of simple songwriting, like 3 or 4 most simple basic chord sequences.
So the band, before they've even got a manager or a record deal, decide to go to Germany. When and why did they go to Germany, and what was the impact on the band?
They had a guy called Alan Williams who was originally from Wales and was acting as their manager, and he had links to clubs in Liverpool and Hamburg, and Hamburg were looking for acts to perform there, and for whatever reason the option came up for some Liverpool acts, and the option came up to the Beatles, who'd mainly just been performing at a famous club called the Cavern, made famous because of its association with the Beatles. So they had this option to go to Hamburg. They went there, 5 times, I think, in total before they had their first professional contract. And as John Lennon said, that's where they became a real band sort of thing. That, you know, they were performing like 8 hours a day, maybe 10 hours, you know, just in amphetamines. That's when they found out about drugs, really, for the first time. They took amphetamines to keep them going. They were just kind of raucous, and the crowd was raucous, and people were fighting, and they just learned how to be a band, really, and they got really tight and became a proper band, really, you know.
Because they were saying that they'd done a show, they'd have a wee break, they'd do a show, have a break, do a show. So as you were saying, sometimes it was up to 8 to even 12 hours a day they would be playing. Yeah. So I think that must have really honed their skills and the bond between them. Yeah. After the last time coming back from Germany, they eventually meet up with what will become their manager, Brian Epstein. Can you tell us anything about this relationship?
Yeah, so Brian had a music store, big Liverpool music store. He had a company called NEMS, that might be the name of the store, I'm not sure. And the Beatles had recorded a couple of songs in Germany with a musician called Tony Sheridan, British guy. So he was like the star kind of thing, relative star. And he was the main guy, and they were the backing band. You know, they were doing the backing vocals and instrumentation. He would be doing lead guitar, not George, because Tony could play lead guitar. So they got a bit of experience in the recording studio. So the first closest things to the first professional recording you can hear of the Beatles are from those Germany recordings. Some people in the store had been asking for this record called My Bonnie, and he didn't know what it was, so he kind of found out what it was, and that was Tony Sheridan and the Silver Beatles, they were called, or something like that, some kind of strange name. So Brian, as soon as anyone asked for something, he would order like 2 or 3 times the demand for it, just because he never wants to have any records that are not available in his store. That was like his thing. So he got these and he kind of listened to them, and he found out who they were and all that, and found out they're from Liverpool, same city as him and all that. And I think he went to see them in the Cavern, and he was just kind of blown away by their energy and just their attitude. I think attitude's a big thing with the Beatles, you know. That's what got them recording contracts and management, even when the music didn't, sort of thing. So yeah, so that's where that came from. He became the manager. I'm not sure he managed anyone before then, apart from like the record shop, which was a family business. And then after that, he managed a lot of other acts, Liverpool acts like Jerry and the Pacemakers and Cilla Black. But I think it really started with the Beatles.
Must have been quite a big risk, because this was January 1962 and they signed a 5-year contract. Right. So from Brian and the Beatles' perspectives, you know, you're taking on a manager who's never managed before, but he does have connections. And for the manager, it's like you're saying, this unknown band almost.
Well, that's where the exploitation comes from record companies. That's happened all the way through. George Michael had a famous court case. He couldn't get out of his contract. He signed as a teenager. He didn't know what he was doing. He had no business experience, you know. And record companies know this, you know. It's like, do you want a 5-year contract with EMI? Yes, I'd love that. Yeah, what the term doesn't matter, you know. I'll sign, you know. So, you know, it's better than busking or playing in the Cavern, as good as they are. If they had the experience that they would have had later in years, obviously, I'm sure they wouldn't have signed it, but or they would have negotiated for better terms. Brian famously was not a good negotiator, though. A lot of the deals that he made wasn't of good benefit financially to any of them, really, including himself. He was very quite soft as a negotiator, so he was very accepting.
So we move into 1963 and we get, as you said, the Beatles' first album, Please Please Me. But as they go into the studio, they end up sacking their drummer at this point.
So that was there was twofold. There was kind of two things that came together to that. One was that he never quite gelled personally with the band. George, Paul, John, they kind of had that close-knit kind of humour and personalities would overlap, and they always described Pete as being a bit different, a bit distant. And Pete was also the most popular of the band at the Cavern. He was the one that would get the most attention from the girls. Maybe there's jealousy there, I don't know.
That's meant to go to the singer, you know.
Yeah. So that might have been an aspect. But then when they did get their audition for the company that they joined, Parlophone, as a subset of EMI, the guy who was the producer there and overseeing the recording said, I'm not too keen your drummer either. And they were like, oh, we were thinking the same thing. So it just kind of, both things came together. And he got sacked when they were on the cusp of being the act that now we all know. So that led him into major depression. And he didn't perform musically for a quarter of a century after that.
It would be one of those things everyone would always remind you, like, you could have been in the biggest, best band in the world.
Well, exactly. And also just the kind of irony of having the name Best as well, you know, in that situation, you know, and stuff like that, you know. It's I'm sure he got a lot of teasing with that, and I mean, he almost ended his own life. He tried to, and yeah, so it was dark stuff for him.
So you mentioned the producer didn't like him as well, and this producer turned out to be, was it George Martin?
George Martin,
who obviously went on to be such a major influence, and many call him the fifth Beatle. Yeah. How was his early relationship? What did he make of the Beatles when he first encountered them?
Not very good musically. So the Beatles had an audition before for another company called Decca, and they failed the audition, you know. Decca then went on to sign Rolling Stones, so they did make a lot of money from them, but they failed the audition. They weren't very good, and they did the same with Parlophone. They kind of would have failed the audition, but George Martin then came down to speak to them afterwards and saying, "No, this is what you're doing wrong. If there's anything you don't like, then just let me know." And George Harrison instantly said, "Well, I don't like your tie for a start." Just everyone fell a bit laughing, and then from then they apparently became comedy machines, and that's what made the deal. It wasn't really the music. The music wasn't very good. Their own songs, there's a couple. One of them kind of stood out as being a bit different. Love Me Do, but if their personalities were flat, they probably wouldn't have got signed.
Just shows you sometimes, yeah, it's the force of who you are as a personality can sometimes make that deal. They Do Please Please Me. What was the first single off this?
It was Love Me Do. That was the best song that they had at the time. They'd been writing songs for a number of years, John and Paul, but they hadn't been writing anything particularly good. They hadn't done that yet, and there was no sign of that going to happen either. They had the energy and they had the personalities, and they were decent as a band, decent musicians, and they had one song that was quite good, and that was enough to get that released. Love Me Do, now I got all the way up to number 17 in the charts, but there's speculation that that's because Brian, the manager who also owned the record store, just bought a lot of copies himself to boost it up the chart. So we don't know if that happened or not, but it might have done. But that got them national attention. I
suppose for younger listeners, that would be the old school version of just listening to your own songs on Spotify through a different account to get your plays and numbers up.
I guess so. And also the single that they released from Love Me Do, that's not the version that you'll hear now. That was they re-recorded it for the album, and the re-recording is the one that you can access now. But the original one was a bit different and a bit scrappy and not as good.
So after they released Love Me Do, did they release any more singles that made an impact of this album?
Well, they didn't have any more songs that George Martin was happy with. So he said they went to Tin Pan Alley, which was that was the done thing then, because people didn't write their own songs. That was, Beatles were very groundbreaking. They performed their own songs as the band. That almost didn't happen. Certainly not to have success in the charts. They were kind of the producers and the A&R men. They would get songs from America that were hits over there, but it hadn't been known over here because times were different then. I mean, if you wanted a record, you'd have to. Liverpool was a good place to kind of not to introduce rock and roll to the UK, but it was a good place to be in because they would get a lot of the records coming over physically on the ships from the sailors from America. That would be the place to dock mainly. It would be Liverpool. So they would get access to these records before anyone else, and then it kind of dispersed from there. One of the many songs that would come over was a song called How Do You Do It? So George Martin said, this is going to be your next song. This is it. You're going to do this. You're going to record it. They did it. They recorded it. They did it in their own version. You might know, how do you do what you do to me? They really didn't want to release it because they said, if we release someone else's song, we can't go back to Liverpool. We can't go back to the cavern. They're going to hate it. They're going to hate us. But they did it. And then George Martin said, well, unless you get something better, this will be your song. They had a song John had written. It was like a kind of ballad, kind of Roy Orbison song. Please, Please Me. Apparently it wasn't very good. They reworked that, completely redid it, and made it into like a rocker, completely different pace and everything. Recorded it. George Martin said that, well done, that's your first number one. We released that instead. Almost went to number one, went to number two. Went to number one in one of the 4 charts, but officially went to number 2. So that's what they did. That's how they got around that. How Do You Do It was given to another one of Brian's acts, during the Pacemakers, went to number 1 for them. And that was the second single. That became a massive hit. On the strength that they recorded their first album, they had to do it like immediately before their luck ran out, sort of thing, when they're still hot. So they went and recorded the rest of the album in one day, like 8 songs I think it was. in a 12-hour session. So yeah, it was just the best songs that they had, some originals and some covers.
It's really interesting you say that about getting stuff out quick while it's hot, because the first album comes out on the 22nd of March 1963, but the second album comes out 22nd of November 1963. So, you know, we're used to waiting maybe 2 years between albums, maybe sometimes longer. So the next album comes out with the Beatles. How does this one go down?
Well, that's the thing. So, I mean, the most successful British band of this century, probably Coldplay, who make an album every 3 years, you know, and that's fine. There's nothing, that's normal, nothing wrong with that. No criticism there. Beatles, of course, made one every 6 months on average, you know, and their albums were events, you know. So the first one really changed the game. It's hard to appreciate that now if you listen to it for the first time and you're not familiar with the era and the style, the genres of music. An act writing their own songs and performing their own songs and having success for that was really groundbreaking.
It obviously must have opened the doors for record companies saying maybe there's other people out there who can write.
It completely opened the door, yeah.
They're going to make us money.
Yeah, and it was hugely influential. I mean, Rolling Stones didn't write any of their own songs. The first album, they were not only were there not any songs by them on it, they didn't have any songs that they could have given, because they weren't songwriters at all. It's only afterwards that the manager physically locked Richards and Jagger in a room, actually locked them in the room and said, "Do not come out to write a song. The Beatles can do it, you can do it." Their first hit was actually a Beatles song given to them.
That's right. It's quite funny to hear the difference in the two songs when you hear the Beatles version and then the Stones version.
Yeah, because they both came out about the same month. So yeah, so there was that revolution. Now it's hard to when you hear it now, but at the time, that was really like whoa. You know, people was like, and on all levels, public people and A&R people and record company, everyone's like, what? This is a new thing. You know, they're actually writing their own songs and they're good. And like I say, the first song on the Beatles playlist is that I've added is "I Saw Her Standing There." Now, anyone else would release that as a single. They just kept it as an album track. It's like, you know, I mean, that's a brilliant song. That album went to the top of the UK charts, and it stayed there for 6 months, and then it was replaced by their second album. That's what knocked it off. You know, and then I was at the top for 21 weeks. So I think it was like 51 weeks consecutively they were at the top of the album charts in the UK.
That's amazing. You'll never see that ever again.
Bizarre, isn't it? It's bizarre. But right from the first album, they were, you know, just there, and that's Beatlemania, right from the first album. Obviously, they had to work to that for years to get to that stage. Yeah, so that was the impact of the first album, you know. And then the second album, the first one, when they did the first one, it was just the best songs that they had. And the second one, they actually knew what they were doing, you know, the second album. But like I said before, they didn't have any of the, when they made You Love Me Do, they didn't have any good songs apart from that. Then they were able to write one more good song, and then they had a couple more they put in the album, and that was it. They had nothing else, you know. And then they wrote From Me to You, big hit, number one, first number one. Then they wrote She Loves You, number one. Then they had the second album, 8 new songs on that and 6 covers. Great songs, some great songs. I think there's one on the playlist. I think it's the opening track. It's called It Won't Be Long. And then they had I Want to Hold Your Hand. So then from almost nowhere, not that they hadn't been writing songs, they had been writing songs for years, but they hadn't been writing songs of that quality, you know, and originality. That kind of came from nowhere. No one expected that. George Martin never expected that. No one saw it coming. It just happened. And then it kept on happening for the next 8 years. You know, they kept on just writing these songs that were just progressing pop music, not just their own catalogue, but just pop music.
Sounds like there was a big jump in confidence. You're saying obviously there's a couple of tracks on the first album which are single material which they left, whereas they're a bit more confident now with the Beatles on their second album, where they're like, yeah, we'll put All My Love in, I Won't Be Long, Please Mr. Postman. These all become quite well-known songs. Yeah, and
Please Mr. Postman, that was one of the Tin Pan ones. That was from America. Roll of Beethoven, Chuck Berry song. But certainly All My Love, and that, I mean, that's who else would not release that as a, you know, that's a single, that's like your first single ever, you know, and they just put it as an album and say, well, in fact there was no singles released from that album at all, which is really bizarre as well. And they did that with half their albums because they wanted to give people as much value for money as possible, which is again a really bizarre or innovative concept. In this country it happened different in America, but that wasn't their choice. Yeah, so in the second album is they knew what they're doing. The songs are just generally better on average, and their sound is better as well on average.
Yeah, you can definitely see it's a band picking up its game, and as you said, it's a brand new thing for them to be writing songs, so it's good to see that steady progression. So they move on from the Beatles, and then in July '64 we get the third album, A Hard Day's Night, and things are really starting to step up now as well in terms of America. So what kind of went on with this album?
So I mean so there was more than an album for this. There was a film as well that was recorded, that was made when they were making the album. So that was their first film that they made, and that was a drama, a dramatic film, and they're actually acting. They're playing a version of themselves. Of course, they had the album to go with that, but the album would have just gone with it anyway. And that was around that time that sort of America discovered the Beatles, about the same time as Hard Day's Night came out, and that's when I think the Beatlemania term, I don't know if it's coined before that, but it was certainly in full swing then, and that's when they became the huge international stars rather than just huge UK stars. And of course, you get the American market and UK market, then you get all these other markets come with that, around the world as well. Yeah, so that was the Hard Day's Night period. The Hard Day's Night, the whole album was written by them. Again, that's what you'd expect now, right? But then to have 13 songs that are all original, just 5-6 months after their second album or something like that. And the songs, it's one of my favourite albums of anyone by all time, because I just think it's so impressive for them to do that, and for the songs to be of such great quality, I think.
So when they went to America, I think one of the big things was the Ed Sullivan Show that really helped to push them, because I think they got over, Ed had a regular weekly audience of 70 million people, which is even more than the UK population even today.
Yeah, I mean that was like the biggest entertainment show in America. He was like Johnny Carson of his time. Yeah, so that's when Brian Epstein managed to secure the Beatles. I think they were on it like 3 Saturdays in a row, for like a really cut price deal. But that was actually smart businessmanship, because they knew that the money didn't matter, the exposure mattered. So they were able to secure like 3 weeks in a row on this show. And I think it was the first one, was the most watched TV show of all time in America because of the Beatles. That's what tipped it over the regular viewing figures. People had been hearing about the Beatles but didn't know who they were and stuff like that, and some of them might not have even heard the music, they just didn't hear about them. So people were like watching, like, who, as we'll get onto later, Brian Wilson was one of the people. He was just sitting like, he was hearing it for the first time, and his brain apparently just melted when he saw it and heard it.
I think the actor Dan Aykroyd said the same thing, because he was a kid at the time, and he said he remembered watching Ed Sullivan Show and it'd be like juggling or cabaret acts, and then on come the Beatles, and as you said, it just melted all their minds. Like, what the hell is this?
And of course they hadn't, I mean, even the people in the UK hadn't seen their progression. They just first album and seen, like, but when they got to the third album, they're really, really great songwriters and stuff like that. Like I say, almost from nowhere. And America hadn't seen this progression. They just saw this band with 3 albums of original material, just all at once sort of thing. And I think that was a real pivotal moment. And it's funny to say it in American culture, because they're not American, but I believe it is. It seems to be a lot of people say that, and just the first time to see the Beatles, if they're old enough to watch it. And it was a really JFK had just been assassinated not long before that, so the country was in a strange time, and I think that helped bring a new sort of era, usher in a new era. Just kind of this, not the happiness of it, but just the excitement of it. It kind of helps you kind of remedy somewhat what just happened, even though they weren't political at all. It's just, but that's probably why it was a remedy, because it was something else, completely. So it did step in to fill some bit of a void as well.
And we're talking as well about how they made the movie, and I think this was part of the cultural change that they brought about. I remember talking to people who were about at the time, and they said we'd all end up singing the songs in the cinema, teenagers, which had never really been done before.
Yeah. I mean, that probably started with Rock Around the Clock, the Bill Haley song, because that was came from a movie. Movie was rubbish, and he was rubbish and everything, but it wasn't like White Richard. It wasn't that exciting, but compared to Nothing, it seemed exciting, and somehow people were ripping up the chairs when they went to see that. But that was like the skiffle level of excitement. It's like the stage one until you get to the next stage. I was just going to mentioning Hard Day's Night, there is a song on the playlist from that. It's the last song on the album, called I'll Be Back, which is one of my favourite early Beatles songs. There you go.
The Beatles are now touring in America as well as the UK. You said, as you said, new markets are opening and sticking to their almost every 6 months. In December '64 we get their fourth album, Beatles for Sale.
Well, again, at that time they had the single release, which is not on the album, which is I Feel Fine, big hit. First use of feedback, I think, on a commercial record. Very innovative. They wouldn't necessarily be the first people ever to do that, but to hear someone else do it and they'd kind of do it in a clever way, and they bring it to public attention. So that was a good example of the feedback on that song. It opens with feedback. Anyway,
I think that is really interesting because it's bringing these different sounds to a more mainstream audience. Like you're saying, other people were doing it, but not a lot of people were hearing it.
But also, it's twofold. There is that, bringing it to mainstream, but also they'd have to be open to like what other stuff was doing. But also the way that they used them was really innovative. The way they used the feedback just to open the record and stuff like that. And on the album, there's a song, big hit in America, called 8 Days a Week, that it faded in at the start. I think that was like the first time that had been done as well. So there's just these little quirky things that now seem like redundant. But then it was like really innovative. It really was innovative. No one had done stuff like that. Fade in a record at the start. Everyone fades out, but to fade in. So yes, that was another album. There's no singles released from that album. Getting the Money's Worth 8 Days a Week was single all over it, but wasn't released. No Reply, I think, is the first song on that album, which is a song from this playlist. Great songs again. I think by that stage they seem to be getting a bit tired of all the touring, because they've been, I don't think, between like summer of '63 and summer of '65, I don't think they were able to have a personal life for the 2 years. They were just being Beatles and touring and interviews and making music and writing all the music as well in that time. Writing the music that would change and influence the rest of the whole music, pretty much popular music.
So was there like a commercial reason why they didn't release singles off certain albums?
Yeah, it was a commercial. It was partly commercial. Well, I'm going to contradict myself if I say that, because America was doing it the opposite for commercial reasons. So what George Martin says, they wanted to give people their money's worth. They didn't want to just release it as a single and then they'd buy a single and then they release the album and then they'd buy the album and the same song was on it again. So there was a bit of that, and they could do that because they had enough good songs that they were writing, more than enough they could have singles that were not on albums and have albums with no singles on it, which is again very unusual. But when I got to America, then they didn't have the influence there, so America was doing the opposite. They would just exploit as much as they could to get as much income as they have. So they'd change all the track lists on the albums, they'd keep the album shorter, and 12 songs on them they'd have like 14 they'd have 11 or 12, and there's duplicates and all that. So they and they added like an extra 3 albums of all stuff. So that their whole system is just kind of a very commercial enterprise. But certainly if you follow the UK system of how things were organised, then I think it was sort of commercial, but it was more to do with, as they say apparently, not giving people their sort of money's worth.
So again, we've got 6 months later, in August '65, they release another album / movie with Help. Yeah. How did this go down, and what was the idea behind doing another movie?
Well, the idea was, again, part of commercial. It'll make money for people, so people will do it, and they said yeah, and probably a bit of fun. And also, there's a bit in there say, well, we've never been to the Bahamas, can we make that put that into the script? And okay, so they got a holiday in Bahamas and stuff like that, So that was a motivation for them. And also, it's a very different film from the first one. It's in colour, first of all. Hard Day's Night was black and white, but it's just completely different. It's very Goons-like, which is a big influence on them. They knew who George Martin was before he signed them, because he produced the Goons and the Beatles loved the Goons. He did comedy records. That's what he was known for, actually, was comedy records before he signed the Beatles. Yeah, so they did this kind of really weird and quirky movie, which I find really, really funny. And, humorous to watch it. And then they made the album, and of course the album was... that was about the same time that they discovered marijuana as well, which actually introduced them by Bob Dylan. The real Bob Dylan was the person that introduced them to weed, to hash, which he'd been enjoying for a couple of years, and they hadn't never tried it before. And then that made everything like a lot more mellow, and they seemed to be, apart people who were saying like around that time when the film sets and stuff, there would just been a lot of time gig on. And I think it gives the fifth album, perhaps that contributes to the happy kind of carefree sound, because the fourth album was getting a bit dark, and I think they were a bit fed up of all the touring and all the being pulled around all the time. I think the cover reflects that as well. They look a bit moody on the cover of the fourth album, Beatles for Sale, and the fifth one's a bit lighter. But the songs, I mean, extraordinary. They wrote Yesterday. I mean, if that was all they'd ever written, that would make them an important act, right?
Just for that one.
Just
song
for that one
alone.
song. That's one of the most covered songs in music. It's like top 3, I think, or something. And Paul McCartney had been carrying that around for like at least the previous 2 albums. He never thought it was his own song. He thought he'd got the tune from someone else, and then eventually no one recognised the tune. He thought, maybe it's mine, so he put words to it. He replaced the words. It was originally Scrambled Eggs. And yeah, so I mean, just great songs. The difference with the movies, I think it's because they were movies, they kind of, to push the movie, and because they're linked to the album, they were singles released from the album. That happened with The Hardest Night as well. But the B-sides, at least, were B-sides. Back then you got A-sides and B-sides, because all the records were physical vinyl things. One side was called A-side, turn it over, you got the B-side. A-side was the single that went into the singles chart. B-side was anything, usually just run-of-the-mill stuff, but the Beatles sides were probably better than a lot of other acts' singles. So anyway, the B-sides that they wrote, they were not on the albums. And then the album is just, it's a brilliant album. Yesterday's on that, and Help and Ticket to Ride, and I think that's probably John's best album for me. Is along with Hardest Night, I would say, is the best, and Help. They're probably the best contributions he made to an album, I think, with his songs. And I think there's there's 2 songs on the playlist from that album. I think there's one of Paul's, which is I've Just Seen a Face, a really great song, and one of John's, which is You're Gonna Lose That Girl.
Yeah, 2 brilliant songs. And I think as well, Ticket to Ride, I remember reading years ago, a lot of people who'd done heavy metal music said that was kind of the beginning of it, which is quite crazy to think. But when you think about it in the terms, you're like, I can actually see what they're saying.
Well, again, it's crazy to think that now, because when you hear metal, you think that it doesn't sound like it. But back then, there was no metal. It never existed ever in the history of human race, right? Never happened. And then I guess it gave him. I actually think an influence was probably as much, if not more so, would be something like You Really Got Me by the Kinks, because that was really innovative to hear that guitar sound, and then maybe that inspired Ticket to Ride, something a bit heavier. Yeah, somewhere within those 2 songs, I think it gave fruit to other ideas that metal might have came from.
So then, as we're moving on throughout 1965, we get to December, we have got Rubber Soul. Yeah. But I think we should also mention just before then that they were actually, as you said earlier, they were kind of getting to the end of their touring. They were getting a bit sick of it, and there was the Jesus affair. Yeah. Would you like to kind of talk to us about that?
Yeah, it was an interview they gave, or John gave, in the UK, when they said something about how the Beatles were bigger than Jesus, and they meant they were more popular than Jesus to the youth at the time. It seemed like a fair comment, priced. It's pretty obvious. Yes, I mean, it didn't seem that controversial to me, and didn't make any headlines and stuff. And then it got reprinted in America a few months later, and then because America's a lot more religious in parts than the UK and take it more seriously and all that, and this became a fanfare. Someone picked up on it and became a fanfare, and then some religious groups were burning Beatles records and publicly and all that, and protesting against the Beatles, and when they're coming to their city to perform, they're putting on protests and stuff like that. I don't think it affected the popularity, because I think the people who liked the Beatles beforehand would just continue liking them. I think it was the people who probably weren't really liking them anyway, so they gave them something to shout about. But I mean, it did create some negative press, whereas before they didn't really have any, so it did seem like a bit of an issue in that regard. Also, America being America, it's quite easy to get guns. JFK was shot, Martin Luther King was shot. There was suggestions that the Beatles or John was going to be next at the concert. The concert's kind of open air and not too difficult to get someone around the venue so that there was kind of real concerns about that could happen. And so I mean, it shouldn't have been an issue, but it was for some people, and John had to mention it at a press conference and talk about it and stuff like that. And that's probably the first time you ever really saw them talk about a serious subject. If you watch that press conference, so that like a real a real serious thing, because before that it was always just silly questions that were getting asked, you know, and stuff like that.
I remember Ringo saying the one good thing that came out of it was after they burnt their records, they all went back out and bought them again, so they just earned more money in the end. Yeah. So one of the big problems at this time as well was touring, and the fact that, as they said, they couldn't hear themselves on stage anymore. How much was this an influence to end in touring for the Beatles?
Yeah, that was one of the influences. So back then, the technology that we're using, the amps, were of course the best that we'd have got back then, but they were less powerful than the cheapest one you'd buy for a home now sort of thing, and that was like the best technology at the time. But like when you watch like an old black and white TV compared to like a smart TV, that's the different sort of thing, you know. And the power of the amps actually doubled each year. You know, they doubled each year, but even still, it wasn't enough. And actually, they were kind of doubling because the Beatles couldn't hear themselves. I think the Beatles had an influence on the technology being sped up to kind of catch up to what they couldn't hear of themselves. And also, for whatever reason, I don't think, you know, nowadays everyone, you see them on stage, they'll have speakers at the front of the stage facing them. Yeah, so they can, I don't think they even did that back then. I'm not sure.
I don't think so.
Yeah, which is kind of strict. That seems like it's not really a technological thing. That's just like, just put some there, link it, you know. I don't think they even did that. So they were here, and when they did their big concerts, like at the Hollywood Bowl in America and stuff like that, big famous concerts. First act ever to do stadium concerts, by the way, I think.
Was that Shea Stadium?
Shea Stadium, and then Hollywood Bowl, yeah. And I think they were just being broadcast to the PA system. Like the baseball announcers would say, wow, you know, next up on that really bad sound system.
Must be really thin sound.
No one would have heard it. No one would have heard them over the screaming, you know, and they couldn't hear themselves. And they actually didn't know, they couldn't hear each other. And they were just kind of, I guess, had a set list they were sticking to. And I think they were just kind of watching Ringo more than listening to him. And one concert afterwards, they said to Ringo, "What were you doing during that song?" And Ringo said, "I didn't know we did that song." You know, they couldn't hear each other. And somehow, but just the visual cues, because they know each other so well and stuff like that, so they just kind of seemed to. But even if they didn't keep it together, it wouldn't matter. No one was there to listen to them. Well,
that's it, because, as you say, these were momentous events to do stadiums, and as George Harrison said years later, I done Shea Stadium twice. You know, because he couldn't even remember doing it a second time, and that just shows, to me anyway, that they couldn't hear themselves, they weren't enjoying it, that it didn't even become memorable. No. So now that they're free of commitments to doing concerts and films, they go into the studio and do Rubber Soul, December 65. And for me, this was the kind of turning point for what would become the rest of their albums and the kind of sounds. So you talk us through Rubber Soul a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, so they released Help. There was 12 original songs, that really, really great songs, you know, just great songs. And then Rubber Soul, some people consider that one of the real key pivotal albums of the 60s by anyone. That was 4 months after Help. You'd think 4 years might be, 4 months.
It kind of puts modern musicians to shame, taking all this time, and they're like 4 months later, we've got 14 songs now on this album, you know?
None of which were released as singles. Plus, there was the singles that released on the same day. There was a double A side, it was a Day Tripper, and We Can Work It Out. So that's 16 new songs, right? And most of those songs are great. Most of them are really good.
It's a solid album.
Solid album, but just like all the previous albums, they were just another progress, another step. I really think that when we mentioned it in the minute, the following album, Revolver, I think that's really when they take the big step rather than Rubber Soul. A lot of people see Rubber Soul, I don't think it is as much. Yeah, they're just kind of progressing. Their everything, their sound, their songwriting, their ideas, the instrumentation, the arrangements. Full of great songs, In My Life and Drive My Car, standard pop songs really, that they're just album tracks for the Beatles. Going back to Help, that was George had 2 songs on that again, so that's when he became a good songwriter really. I Need You and You Like Me Too Much. He had 2 more songs on this album, and then thus continued his songwriting. Yeah, but it's just to think of that key album for them and for many people and many other musicians, how influential that is. 4 months after the previous one, that was the album that inspired Pet Sounds. We'll get onto that later.
Well, as you said, so then 6 months after this, so within a year, we've got the third album, and we've got our third album within a year. So August the 5th, 66, Revolver comes out, and as you said, this is like a real, again, pivotal moment in terms of sound, songwriting.
Well, I mean, I'll just say on the playlist that I put on, and there's a song from Rubber Soul called The Words, that's from there. So Revolver is, that's the first album they made when they had a proper time off before it, a proper holiday, and didn't have many touring and interview commitments for the first time because they didn't want to do it anymore. And it's the first album they made that they never actually performed any of the songs live, and thus they never performed any of the other songs live after that because they never performed again apart from one of the rooftop ones. So from that point onwards, no more songs did they do live. Revolver is the name of the album, incidentally comes because they thought, what do records do? They revolve. That's where the name comes from. It's nothing to do with guns. And of course, by the previous point, Rubber Soul, that's when they were writing all the songs on all their albums. So 14 new songs plus a single and B-sides. So they had 60 new songs for 1966. And this was, for me, this is when this is probably Paul's peak songwriting on that year. Just the idea, they're taking ideas from different things and they kind of put them into the little Beatles package, but by doing that, it's just ridiculous. I think Revolver is just a ridiculous album that these self-taught friends from Liverpool, self-taught musicians, were able to do something of that quality and standard between themselves and with the guidance of George Martin. And I think Revolver for me is probably my favourite album of all time by anyone. It's just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous.
It never stops, in a sense, like it never lets you down. Every song is like a great song, great song, great song.
I mean, Paul's just, I don't know what he was, well, I do know what he was taking. He was taking LSD, but I don't know what kind of influence that had on him. But his 7 songs released that year, and all of them are just gems, like proper gems, like, just like.
And you can see how he's moving forward with a song like Eleanor Rigby. Yeah. He's went in and he's had this song on acoustic guitar, and he's went in and spoke to George, and then they've decided to make it an orchestral piece.
Yeah, so there's no standard rock instruments in that. It's just I was going to say a quartet. It's probably an octet, a string octet. That's all there is, and then just vocals on it. And
it becomes one of the most iconic songs ever.
Yeah, it's just. I mean, that music's to be listened to, first and foremost. So you can't really do it justice. So it's just by talking about it, but it's just. There's a couple of songs that I've put on the playlist from there. Is Here, There and Everywhere, which George Martin regards as Paul's best. And my favourite Paul McCartney Beatles song, or all Paul McCartney songs, is For No One, which is also on the playlist. If you're a Beatles fan, the famous French horn solo in it as well. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's just ridiculous on any scale. Yeah.
I think what's interesting as well, because how you were talking about earlier, Lennon didn't really care about lyrics, but by the time you get to this album, you're getting a lot of experimental lyrics, and I also think that's reflected in the artwork for the album, which is a lot more experimental and almost psychedelic in a sense.
It's the first album that wasn't, the cover wasn't a photo. All the previous ones have been photos of the group in some way. Rubber Soul is quite a cool album. It's kind of out of focus and stuff. But this was a friend of theirs from Germany, an artist and photographer called Klaus Fuhrmann, who was a bass player as well, and went on to be a professional bass musician as well. I think he played the bass on John Lennon's Imagine album and other stuff. So he had this idea for the cover, and he just put it together and he showed it to them and thought, that's it, that's what we're going to do, that's the cover. A really great cover, a collage of all these different images of the group, black and white as well, which is really cool. So John Lennon had released 2 books by that time. I don't know if you know this. So he was, right from a young age at school, he doodled pictures and doodled words and stuff like that, and all these kind of silly little very Goons influenced stuff, Spike Milligan and all that, really crazy little comedy stuff, and he just did it all over the place, and he never stopped it. And then he did it at high school. He made like this magazine, just silly magazine for humour effects. He kept on doing that throughout his life, really, until he died. And then all these kind of notes he had when he was touring, and some the Beatles entourage said, "Oh, what's all this stuff?" It's quite funny and stuff. So he's just the stuff I've been doing. So they compiled it, and he got the best bits, and they put it in a book, and they released it, and it's called In His Own Right. And I think it won like an award or something, and because it was John Lennon, it became like a bestseller. And the following year he followed it up with another one called A Spaniard in the Works, and all these kind of doodles and sketches. One of the 3 most influential books in my life, actually, because I realised that you could just be so silly and it's okay to be silly as an adult, and some really crazy and funny stuff on it. So someone challenged them at the time and said, well, why you've got this wordplay and really witty and funny and odd stuff and all this kind of scrambled in your little doodles and books and stuff. Why are your songs not like that? Your songs are just like the opposite, you know. So maybe there was something came from that challenge, and he decided to actually be a bit more meaningful with his lyrics, the song lyrics.
Do you think some of it was influenced by meeting people like Bob Dylan, where lyrics were so important to his music?
I don't know, but I would guess no. When I said what I said earlier about John saying it's about the sound, not about the words, he was saying it in reference to Bob Dylan, because Bob Dylan's like, oh, you know, the words, man, the words. That's John saying that. And yeah, so I think he probably saw Bob as a bit of a rival, and, you know, the ego's getting in the way and stuff like that, and it's like, unless I'm either going to embrace it or I'm going to do the opposite and kind of criticise it. And I think he did the opposite, and he kind of stood apart and criticised it. There might have been influences. I think Dylan had an influence on their sound. I think the Help album was quite folky, and that definitely came from, I think, Dylan, just like he was influenced by them and went electric. They had that mutual influence on each other. In terms of lyrics and words, I'm not so sure. I'm not really convinced that it would be much of an influence on him.
So the Beatles decided to give themselves 9 months now between the next album, you know, a wee bit of a break, and then the 26th of May 1967 we get again another iconic album in Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
Yeah, well I think that's the album that's considered most associated with them, probably. In fact, perhaps most associated with the 1960s by anyone, perhaps. I think that's their biggest selling album. I think it was like, even though the previous albums have been huge, this was even more huge. And again, this was, it's probably considered the most innovative album that they made as well, before or after. It's the album when they have, it's the most, this was the one that was inspired by Pet Sounds. Pet Sounds was inspired by Rubber Soul, and this was their response to Pet Sounds, sort of thing. And then that's when they just have all their production techniques and ideas and arrangements. They really turn up to 11, but they get right on the money, just like when we get to Pet Sounds. You know, it's not, for me, it's not overproduced or anything like that, like some people might say that about ELO. I like ELO, but it's just, you know, everything's just all these ideas, but just really kind of really innovative, and but just great, you know. It's just, and they really, in some of the stuff, I mean, Strawberry Fields was recorded for that album. It wasn't on the album, that was a single. Like I say, they keep the singles and album tracks apart. Strawberry Fields is just like, it's one of the things it's like, if you ever watched 2001 Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick film, it's like, where's the previous things that led up to that? You can't see it, you know. It's like this thing just comes out from nowhere. It's like, wow, what how I think Strawberry Fields is one of those rare songs that does that. It's like, where did that come from?
It says so much about their confidence. Any other band in the world, that would have been like your first single of your new album.
Well, that George Martin said that was the biggest mistake of his career, when it wasn't on the album, because he said it should have been on the album. But at the time, Brian Epting was really pressing him for because 1966 only had one album that year, you know, and people were like, oh, what the Beatles doing? They're having a bit of a lull. What they're doing? They're not touring. They're not doing, you know, and some people are getting a bit paranoid, and Brian was getting paranoid. Right, we're going to do. So it said the next single, we need the best song they've ever had, best ever. I think it had recorded 4 songs for that time for the new album, so they decided to release the best 2 songs as a double A side: Penny Lane by Paul, Strawberry Fields Forever by John. And it's a really weird thing that at the time, all the previous songs that went to number 1, like the previous 10 songs or something, were all number 1 in UK charts. And this one, because it was released as a double A side, so they both get equal status on the record, one side Strawberry Fields, one side Penny Lane, somehow they actually compete against each other in the charts. They weren't combined, the sales, so right. That actually stopped it from getting to number 1, because they were competing. So
strange.
Yeah, really strange, because if it didn't happen that way, it would have clearly got to number 2, despite it being their best song ever. It's a collection of songs, and it was like held off by Please Release Me by Humperdinck or something. So that was one reason George said it was a mistake, because they released them as a double A side rather than just a single, and then it would have sold the same amount of times, but it would have been counted differently. There's a really weird business thing there. But also, because they'd put the best songs out already, and they didn't want to put them on the album, that weakened the album a bit. Later he said he should have had the strongest album possible, because it was Sgt. Pepper, and it was meant to be a bit of a concept album about nostalgia, about Liverpool and stuff, and they were both nostalgia songs, and they didn't make them anyway.
And I think at this point the Beatles are, as we've talked about earlier, you know, they're pioneering new techniques, And they started off with the idea that they would have every song flow into the next song. And as I think Ringo once said, they got from track 1, Sgt. Pepper's, to track 2, and they went, that's a lot of work.
Yeah, there's a bit of an idea. Yeah, and it happened a wee bit later on with Good Morning, Good Morning. It goes on the Animal Sounds at the end or something, and goes on to another song. So it does kind of medley a little bit, but it's kind of described as a concept album, because the concept is, when they were making it, they say we are not the Beatles. We've done the Beatles. We don't want to be the Beatles anymore. We'll pretend we're someone else. We'll pretend we're this band called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which changed to Sgt. Pepper, and then that'll free us up to do, and it kind of works, and give us different ideas and different sounds and stuff. But as John said, most of the songs on there could be on any album. They're not linked to it at all. It's really just the Sgt. Pepper songs, the book and the album, the opening and the closing, and the rest of them are just songs. So this concept thing is a bit kind of, is it wishy-washy, someone may say, and they are largely standalone songs, but the album does have a nice flow to it. I think although I think for me Revolve is a better collection of songs, I think Iron Sgt. Pepper has a better flow to it. That kind of really works as the flow of the album. But more than the sum of its parts, it probably is the best album, I would say, for me. Although I still prefer Revolver. So
after this, they actually end up taking a wee break in February '68 and going over to India.
Yeah, they did. They made I think I'm just going to mention that I think there's 2 songs from the album I've got in the playlist. One is Getting Better, It's Getting Better. One is She's Leaving Home. Another, just like Eleanor Rigby, there's no standard rock instruments on it. It's all orchestration, mainly the harp, playing what would normally be an acoustic guitar part. And then they made their 3rd film called Magical Mystery Tour, which is really art house. And they made a soundtrack to go with that. So there's some new songs to go with that. So then they went to India. That's with some other people like Donovan and some of the Beach Boys, and went to discover what there was to discover in India. I guess they'd probably never been there before. I think John and George were the ones that kind of most interested in that, but they all went and just to try out the scene and culture, and this Maharishi yoga figure who's some kind of public guru somehow, and it was pushing meditation. So they went and checked out. So I think they went there for like a month or 2 with their acoustic guitars. Paul thought they weren't allowed to take acoustic guitars, so he didn't take one, but then he found out the others had, so when he got there he managed to get one from somewhere, which is probably harder than it sounds because he's left-handed, all the others are right-handed. They wrote many songs there, enough for a double album, so they made a double album when they came back.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I think this period really did influence, and especially Harrison's songwriting for the next album, which was what we call it the White Album. I think it's really just called The Beatles, and that was released in November 1968.
Yeah, so 30 songs. A lot of the songs are not very good. As George Martin said, he wanted to make a single album with all the best songs. They were adamant they were going to make a double album, put all the songs on it. And that's almost a large contrast to Sgt. Pepper. Sgt. Pepper was kind of working as a band, sort of. Paul was kind of leading it, and it was all kind of all these great ideas, and the arrangement, production, everything was really turned up to 11. Whereas the White Album was the different. It was really the opposite. It was really kind of lo-fi almost. They were working individually in separate studios. They'd have 3 studios on at a time with each of their separate songs, George and Paul and John. And again, big single at the time, Hey Jude, Revolution, again not on the album, and Lady Madonna before that, and Inner Light, again not on the album. Yeah, that was very contrasting feel and sound to the stuff they're doing the previous year. Mixed result, some good, very good songs, but they weren't trying to compete with Sgt. Pepper, because that would be a silly thing to do anyway. They were just doing a different thing,
I think George is right though. I think if they'd maybe cut it back to 12 or even 14 songs, they could have made another world-class album, because there is easily 12 to 14 great tracks. It's just the fact that there's 30.
Yeah, I would definitely nudge about 10 off there and maybe make a good album and maybe a little EP on the side or something. That's what I would do, but it's nothing to do with me. I mean, I wasn't even conceived. I was 15 years away from being conceived back then, so no one would have listened. Could have listened to me back then, never mind would have done. So
following really quickly on the back of this album, you've got January '69, and we have Yellow Submarine, which again is accompanied by another film, but again a wee bit different this time. We're going to animation.
Well, it's the 4th movie. It's different because it's animated. It's all animated, and it's also different because the Beatles are not actually in it. It's actors pretending to be the Beatles, because they say, well, we are not very good at acting, so they're just doing voice roles. They're not, it's not animated. So they said we'll just get people to Sound Like Us and Pretend Us. And a little bit like the Vultures and Jungle Book, which came out, when did that come out? The year before, 67, was it?
I always, when I was a kid, thought the Vultures were the Beatles and the Jungle Book.
I actually watched it a couple of days ago with my boys. First time I watched it in years, and they're not. Two of them sound like the Beatles and two of them don't.
Right.
What I realised. And there's only two actors doing all four of them. Anyway, so The Ocean Rain, and 4 new songs to go with that. They were just songs that were they had left over. Hey Bulldog's a very good song. Well, it's not a good song, but it's a good sound. It's a good record. It's like it's a good sound. It's very energetic. I think that's on the playlist.
I always thought that was one of their best tracks that most people had never heard of.
Yoko Ono, who is now with John Lennon, that was his new partner and future wife. She was quite critical of that song because she said, "You're the Beatles. You've got this stage to do stuff, important stuff. Why would you do a song about Hey Bulldog?" And John's like, "Yeah, you're right, actually, yeah." So she was quite critical of it, like the lyrics of it, and because it's just meaningless, But it's great. It's great rock and roll. So great piano riff and all that. I think I bypassed some of the songs I put in the playlist from the White Album. I think Blackbird is from there, Paul McCartney, beautiful Paul McCartney song, which he still does in concerts. And I think the other one was Happiness is a Warm Gun, which is John Lennon, which is perhaps the most innovative song from the album. It's kind of 3 separate parts all put together. Very cool. Yeah, so and then Yellow Submarine and Fanfare Music, and a bit of a side project really. It's not a proper, they just had 4 new songs sort of thing, for it, so yeah.
And obviously they had All You Need Is Love, which ended up being the first broadcast across the whole world, first song to ever be broadcast live.
Yeah, so that was after doing Sgt. Pepper, and that was the big thing in music at the time. And then they were part of this thing. It was like, I don't know what all the other stuff were on, but it was like all going to different countries. It was a live broadcast, all different countries, and they all had like their different sections, and they were doing a piece each and different things, and they could be represented in whatever way they were represented by. In the UK, were represented by the Beatles, and of course at the time that was like super innovative to have this live satellite going around the world. This was like the first time it'd been done, I think, like that, and being broadcast in colour as well, which is unusual. So they were the UK entrance with the Beatles, and they had this song, what they're gonna do after Sgt. Pepper. The song was John, All You Need Is Love, disputed by the Beatles himself afterwards whether it was written specifically for that event or not. And there they are, just kind of chewing gum, John and Paul, looking pretty cool. This amazing song again, this great B-side, Baby Rich Man. Yeah, so that was that.
So we move into the Beatles' last 2 albums, and we have Abbey Road released first, then Let It Be, but I'm sure they were recorded the other way around.
Yeah, so after the White Album, they really wanted to get together as a band again, because they didn't feel like they'd done that for a while. Even Sgt. Pepper, they were doing different, kind of not quite band as such sort of thing. The White Album was the complete opposite. They're kind of very individual and stuff like that. And they had a collective desire between John and Paul, at least, I don't know about the other two, to get back to how they did things before, because all the first 5 albums, they were all recorded live. They only had 2 tracks to record onto, whereas nowadays you can have as many as you want. A digital recording, you can have hundreds if you want to. Even at home you can do that easily. Then they just had 2 tracks. That's how it was when the Sgt. Pepper was super innovative, because it had 4 tracks for the first time. Yeah, so everything was recorded. So they wanted to try and do that again, try and record everything live and just go back to how it was, go back to the roots. So that was their idea, and they were rehearsing Let It Be. Also, they were rehearsing it. They made it as a band. They made the whole project as a band rather than before they'd write all their songs at home and bring it in. By the way, this is also unusual. So when they came into the studio, the first 3 years or so, the first 6 albums, they came into the studio, John and Paul had written all their songs, and the other 3 of them, the non-songwriters of each song, they never heard the song before. They didn't know the song, so they had they just do it now and do it, and that's it done. You don't go back to it. So all those guitar parts and drum parts, they just done that instantly, and they did no sort of pre-anything to do it. All these great guitar lines and great drumming. People, I mean, if you want to know how good a drummer Ringo is, and you're not a drummer, I'm not a drummer, well, just listen to what other drummers say. A lot of drummers, Dave Grohl and Phil Collins, so respectful of Ringo. He's doing things that a lot of people. Jeff Lynne says he's the best drummer he's ever worked with.
I think a lot of them say as well, he does the right thing at the right time.
Exactly. Ringo says he freezes whenever it comes to a drum solo. He hates that stuff. He just wants to keep it simple. And I think a lot of people seem to appreciate that.
It ends up having some of the most iconic drum fills in songs because of that.
Yeah, the end, and A Day in the Life and the fills in between stuff like that.
She said, which is 1 2 fill 1 2 fill.
He considers that his best drumming. She said, is that right? No, it's not. Sorry, Rain. He considers Rain his best drumming. Yeah. But Ian MacDonald, who's written the best ever books on the Beatles called Revolution in the Head, he considers She Said is Ringo's best drumming.
And I think as well with the new documentary that's on Disney Plus with the Beatles, and obviously that's why you're saying they're doing the Let It Be, you actually get to see how much a writing machine Paul McCartney is. Yeah. You know, the fact that they're struggling, and then he comes in, he's like, I've been trying to do this, and you see him getting come together. No, it wasn't Come Together, it was Get Back. That's it, sorry. Yeah. So you see Paul McCartney as a writing machine, and you see him writing Get Back, you know, in the studio, and it's really inspiring as a musician. But I think for anyone to say, look, if you're really working hard at your art, that you get to this stage where you can come in and you can basically put out like what ends up being another classic track. Yeah,
well, I completely went off track there, because to go back to what you actually 10 minutes ago, what you asked me was... So that was the next project after the.
So this is Let It Be after Yellow Submarine, but just for the listeners, this ends up becoming the last album to be released.
Yeah. So the way that happened was that they had this project. They're going to get back together as a band and do it live, just like the olden days and stuff like that, and record it live, kind of no or very minimal overdubs and all that. And George put in an outside musician called Billy Preston, amazing American keyboard pianist. Because he thought it'd be more harmonious if someone else was in, and he was probably right. He thought that people were less likely to argue when this outsider was in. Worked before with Eric Clapton, he came in for a song on the White Album, and on that day everyone was very respectful, they said. So he brought in Billy Preston. He's just a fabulous musician as well, fabulous piano player. So he plays some of the very skillful piano solos and like Get Back, the song Get Back, and some of the other stuff. So yeah, so they did all this rehearsing as a band in a film studio. It's all being filmed. That was their idea as well. We'll film it all, and then we'll do something with it. We'll do something with the music. And the idea was to have it all performed live in front of an audience, and that was the album. You know, it's kind of a very different way of doing things. Now they did all that, but then they just kind of disagreed on how it was going to get done. They never finished it. They had all this hours and hours and hundreds of hours, I think, film footage of it, and they just kind of fell apart and disintegrated, and they just never did anything with it, really. George Martin thought the Beatles were finished.
Because George Harrison walked out at this point.
Yeah, he walked out and he came back, and Ringo walked out, and he walked out during the White Album actually and came back. They were on the verge of breaking up, and George Martin thought that was it, that was the last project. He wasn't really involved in that. That was the first time he wasn't involved, and they thought that was it, it's done, that's the Beatles gone. Then they gave him a call saying, we're going to get back one more album, it's going to be like it was before. George Martin said, I'll only do it if I can be the producer like it was before. They said, yep. He said, do you mean it? He said, yep. So they got one more album, and they made Abbey Road, and that was made like a proper album. That was released as a proper album, 1969. Then they finished the Let It Be project, and then it was released the year after, but it was mostly recorded before. Yeah.
And again, both albums are great. You know, there's some cracking songs throughout both, and they're very solid albums.
Yeah, some of the best songs in popular music, I would say, and not all of their albums. Let It Be, Let It Be, Long Way the Road, I think two of Paul's very best songs, ballads. Get Back, one of the best rockers, you know. Two of Us is a song I've put on the playlist from that, beautiful song. These are all from the Let It Be sessions, some fine George songs, I Me Mine. And then I've Got a Feeling as well. And then jump over to Abbey Road, which was mostly made after Let It Be, but released the year before. That's the last proper album. It's certainly the last one they made. It's kind of the last kind of album that was meant to be an normal album they made, and that's really great. And again, that's like come together, and that's when George really realised his potential as a songwriter. He wrote Something and Here Comes the Sun.
Something is an unbelievable track. Yeah. And just thinking back to talking about, there were guys who basically self-taught. You even come to Paul McCartney's bass line on Something, and it's something else.
Yeah. George, it was too much for George. George didn't really like it. It was just too much going on.
Because I'm a bass player myself, and listening back to me, like the bass makes the whole track. Because what was it? Lennon said that McCartney was like a melodic bass player. Yes. You know, he was basically singing melodies on his bass, and I think he really nails it with that one.
There's a bit from the Let It Be movie when John's very unusually trying to play the bass, and Paul's at the piano, and Paul's telling him, "You're doing this, dum da dum. Can you do it like this, dum da dum dum dum? You be a bit more, you just, you be a bit more interested and stuff." And John's like, "Yeah. He couldn't do it." And Paul wasn't a bass player either. It was, he didn't play bass until Stuart, the artist, Stuart Sutcliffe, stayed in Germany when the Beatles left Hamburg and came back to Liverpool, and needed a bass player, so Paul took it over and started playing bass. And just because Paul's self-taught, he's extremely accomplished as a musician. He can play 4 instruments extremely well, and not just play them well, but he can be very innovative with all 4 instruments, and just amazing musical brain. And where were the bass player? So yeah.
So basically, the Beatles then break up after Let It Be's released. How did this come about? Was it a mutual decision?
So the idea of Let It Be, like I said, was all meant to be live and meant to be like kind of no overdubs and all that stuff. And then this unfinished project, it was just kind of like lying there with some amazing songs recorded, just lying there gathering dust, like Let It Be and along the way the road. And then John and George went behind Paul's back, and they went and contacted Phil Spector, who had no involvement with the Beatles prior to that, and Phil famous, very successful, influential American music producer, produced responsible for like what they call the Wall of Sound in the mid-60s, and Be My Baby and Unchained Melody, and all these great productions. So they went to get him, and he did it, and he kind of spectored it. He put all this kind of orchestration on it and all this kind of mushy stuff, and just really changed what was meant to be the intent and the concept of the album. This was done to all the songs, including Paul's songs. Paul had no knowledge of this. I think John and George, for whatever reason, they were just fed up with Paul. Too much personality clashes, and Paul was lots of ideas and a bit controlling without meaning to be, I think, and so that was their response to go and do that. Yeah, so that's how the album got finished, through the sort of Phil Spector production of it, and it got put out that way. So his name is, he gets a production credit, which is the only time that had ever happened on any Beatles tracks. It's not George Martin. Mm-hmm. George Martin, he made the request that could it say this album's produced by George Martin, overproduced by Phil Spector, which it absolutely was, because it was just awful. Paul McCartney revisited this decades later when he made Let It Be Naked and took all that stuff off it, and I think better suits it. You don't need all that, and it's how it's meant to be. So that's how that was finished off. It was just done, but because that had happened and Paul was super pissed off about that happening, rightfully I think. Well, he released his first solo album at the same time, just came out before Let It Be, and he never made any press statements where he said he wasn't going to, but he released a whole list of like 47 or something questions and answers, like, are the Beatles over, da 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 da, and it's just all answered there, and say, this is the press statement, I'm not going to do anymore. John and George are super pissed off about that, so that was effectively over. That was the album, that was the Beatles over, and then he just had to sort it out with the lawyers over the next couple of years. But John and George were ready to get out. They were done.
And that's it for this week. If you would like to join the discussion, or have any questions, or would even like to be a guest on the show, you can email us at discoverhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on social media at Discover History Podcast, except Twitter, which is at History Podcast. Thanks for listening.